Welcome. Before we get started on today's story, I'd like to take a moment and fill you in on a little historical perspective. Like most fairy tales or stories of folklore, there are no hard-written, fast rules. Many of these tales were by word of mouth, not in written form, and passed down through generations as life lessons to children. The basic premise or various morals of this story might or are pretty much the same. However, names, locations, numbers of this, that, or the other thing might change, but these nuances take nothing away in the end. In this version of Sleeping Beauty as written by Perrault and Couch, with, some perhaps ill-advised meddling of my own, some of the names might change from their original referral because, that's how they hit me when I was combining these versions, and mainly because Perrault was originally written in French, and, things get lost in translation. But don't let this distract you. It just adds some levity, yet takes nothing away. And remember, no matter what utterances of stupidity you might hear, it's all me. I need no artificial service to aid in the ridiculousness of my character voices. Besides, I bet there are many of you who are going to have enough issues with the ogres in Sleeping Beauty, as I'm going to guess many of you knew nothing about them. So, have a seat, or snuggle up in your favorite spot, and, let me tell you this story. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who lacked but one thing on earth to make them entirely happy. The king was young, handsome, and wealthy. The queen had a nature as good and gentle as her face was beautiful, and they adored one another, having married for love, which is, among kings and queens, not always the rule. Moreover, they reigned over a kingdom at peace, and their people were devoted to them. What more, then, could they possibly want? They wanted one thing very badly, and the lack of it grieved them more than words can tell, for they had no children. They traveled all the waters of the world. Vows, pilgrimages, all different ways were tried. Yet, for a long while, nothing. And the poor queen, especially, was in despair. At last, however, to her own and her husband's inexpressible joy, she gave birth to a daughter. As soon as the palace guns announced this event, the whole nation went wild with delight. Flags waved everywhere, bells were set pealing until the steeples rocked. Crowds tossed up their hats and cheered, while the soldiers presented arms. And even strangers, meeting in the street, fell upon each other's necks, exclaiming, "Our queen has a daughter! Yes, yes, our queen has a daughter! Long live the little princess!" A name now had to be found for the royal babe. And the king and queen, after talking over some scores of names, at length decided to call her Aurora, which means the dawn. The dawn itself, thought they, was never more beautiful than this darling of theirs. The next business, of course, was to hold a christening. They agreed that it must be a magnificent one, and as a first step, they invited all the fairies they could find in the land to be godmothers to the Princess Aurora, and that each one of them might bring her a gift, as was custom with fairies in those days, so that she might have all the perfections imaginable. After making long inquiries, for I should tell you that all this happened not so many 100 years ago, when fairies were already growing somewhat scarce. They found 7, but this again pleased them, because 7 is a lucky number. After the ceremonies of the christening, while the trumpeters sounded their fanfares and the guns boomed out again from the great tower, all the company returned to the royal palace to find a great feast arrayed. And seats of honor had been set for the 7 fairy godmothers, and before each was laid a case of massive gold, with a dish of solid gold, and beside the dish a spoon, a knife, and fork, all of pure gold, and all set with diamonds and rubies. Just as they were seating themselves at the table, to the dismay of everyone there, appeared in the doorway an old crone, dressed in all black and leaning on a crutched stick. Her chin and her hooked nose almost met together like a pair of nutcrackers, for she had very few teeth remaining, but between them she growled to the guests in a terrible voice.
"I am the fairy Ugly Anne. Pray, where are your king's manners that I have not been invited?"
Well, she had in fact been overlooked, and this was not surprising, because she lived at the far end of the country in a lonely tower set around by the forest. For 50 years she had never come out of this tower, and everyone believed her to be dead or enchanted. And that, you must know, is the commonest way that fairies have of ending. Well, they lock themselves up in a tower or within a hollow oak, and are never seen again. The king, though she chose to accuse his manners, was in fact the politest of men. He hurried to express his regret, led her to a table with his own hand, and ordered a case to be brought to her, but with all the best will in the world, he could not give her a ladened case such as the others had, because 7 only had been made for the 7 invited fairies. Though the old crone received his excuses very ungraciously, while accepting a seat, though it was plain that she had taken deep offense. One of the younger fairies, Hopalotopotamus, who sat by Ugly Anne, overheard her mumbling threats between her teeth, and fearing she might bestow some unlucky gift upon the little princess, rose from the table and hid herself close by the cradle behind the tapestry, that she might have the last word and undo, so far as she could, what evil the fairy Ugly Anne might have in her mind. She had scarcely concealed herself before the other fairies began to advance, one by one, to bestow their gifts upon the princess. The youngest promised her that she should be the most beautiful creature in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, a marvelous grace in all her ways. The fourth, that she should dance to perfection. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play exquisitely on all instruments of music. But now came the turn of the old fairy, Ugly Anne. Her head nodded with spite and old age together, as she bent over the cradle and shook her crutch staff above the head of the pretty babe, who slept on sweetly, too young and too innocent as yet to dream of any such thing as mischief in this world.
"This is my gift to you, Princess Aurora,"
announced the hag, still in her creaking voice that shook as spitefully as her body.
"I promise that one day you shall pierce your hand with a spindle. On that day, you shall surely die."
At these terrible words, the poor queen fell back, fainting into her husband's arms. Trembling seized the whole court. The ladies were in tears, and the younger lords and knights were calling out to seize and burn the wicked witch. When the young fairy stepped forth from behind the tapestry, and passing by Ugly Anne, who stood scornful in the midst of this outcry, she thus addressed their majesties. "Oh, take comfort, O king and queen. Your daughter shall not die thus. It is true I have not the power wholly to undo what this elder sister of mine has done. The princess must indeed pierce her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a deep slumber that shall last for 100 years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and awake her. Whenever this misfortune happens to your little Aurora, do not doubt that I, the great fairy, Hopalotopotamus, her godmother, shall get news of it and come at once to render what help I may." Well, the king, while declaring himself infinitely obliged to Hopalotopotamus, could not help feeling that hers was but cold comfort at best. He gave orders to close the christening festivities at once. Although the fairy, Ugly Anne, their spoiled joy, had already taken her departure, passing unharmed through the crowd of folks, every one of whom wished her ill, and riding away, it was generally agreed, upon a broomstick. But to satisfy the king's faithful subjects, however, who were unaware of any misadventure, the palace fireworks were duly let off with a grand finale, blazing and skywriting, "Long live the Princess Aurora," in all the colors of the rainbow. But His Majesty, after bowing from the balcony amid the banging of rockets and hissing of the Catherine wheels, retired to a private room with his chamberlain, and there, still amid the noise of explosions and cheering, drew up the first harsh proclamation of his reign. Though it forbade anyone, on pain of death, to use a spindle in spinning, or even to have a spindle in their house. The heralds took copies of this proclamation and marched throughout the land reading it to the sound of trumpets from every marketplace, and it gravely puzzled and distressed all who listened, for the women folk prided themselves on their linen. Its finesse was a byword throughout the neighboring kingdoms, and they knew themselves to be famous for it. "But what sort of linen," said they, "would His Majesty have us spin without spindles?" They had a great affection, however, as we have seen, for their monarch. And for 15 or 16 years, all the spinning wheels were silent throughout the land, save one. The little Princess Aurora grew up without ever having seen a spinning wheel or spindle. But one day, the king and queen being absent and at one of their country houses, she gave her governess the slip, and running at will through the palace, upstairs, and from one chamber to another, she came at length to a turret with a winding staircase, from the top of which a strange whirring sound attracted her, and seemed to invite her to climb. As soon as she followed after the sound, on a sudden, it ceased. But still she followed the stairs, and came to an open door at the very top, through which she looked in and saw an honest old woman sitting alone, winding her distaff. The good soul had never in 16 years heard of the king's prohibition against spindles, and, well, this is just the sort of thing that happens in palaces. "Who are you, and what are you doing?" asked the princess. "There's some who call me Tim, and I am spinning, pretty one," answered the old woman, who did not know who Princess Aurora was. "Spinning? What is that?" asked the princess. I do wonder sometimes," said the old woman, "what the world is coming to in these days. A girl not knowing how to spin wool." And that, of course, was natural enough, and might occur to anybody after having lived so long as she had lived in a garret on the top of a tower. Spinning," she said wisely, "is, well, spinning, or was, and gentle or simple, no one is fit to keep house until she has learnt to spin." "Oh, but how pretty it is," said the princess. How do you do it? Give it to me. Let me see if I can do it so well." She had no sooner grasped the spindle, for she was overeager perhaps, or just a little clumsy, or maybe the fairy decree had so ordained it, that it pierced her hand, and she dropped down in a swoon. Well, the old woman, in a flurry, ran to the head of the stairs and called for help. There was no bell rope, and her voice, being weak with age and her turret in the remotest corner of the palace, it was long before anyone heard her cries in the servants' hall. The servants, too, in the absence of the king and queen, were playing cards and could not be interrupted by anybody until their game was finished. Then they sat down and discussed whose business it was to attend on a call from that particular turret. And this again proved to be a point of contention, since nobody could remember having been summoned there, and all were against setting up a precedent, as they called it, of just running to any old scream. But in the end, they decided to send up the lowest of the junior page boys. Oh, but he had a weakness, which he somehow forgot to mention. That of fainting at the sight of blood. So when he reached the garret and fainted, the old woman had to begin screaming all over again. This time they sent up a scullery maid, who, being good-natured and unused to the ways of the palace, made the best haste she could into the garret, whence presently she returned with the terrible news. The servants, who had gone back to their game, now dropped their cards and came running. All the household, in fact, came pouring up the turret stairs. The palace physicians themselves crowded in such numbers that the poor Princess Aurora would have been hard-pressed for fresh air, could fresh air have restored her. They dashed water on her face, unlaced her, slapped her hands, tickled the soles of her feet, burned feathers under her nose, rubbed her temples with spirits of rosemary. They held consultations over her by twos and threes, and again in grand committee, but nothing would awaken her. Meanwhile, a messenger had ridden off post-haste to the king, and while the doctors were still consulting and shaking their heads, the king and queen came galloping home to the palace. In the midst of his grief, he laid recollection as to what the fairies had foretold, and being persuaded, since they had said it, this was fated to happen. Well, he blamed no one, but gave orders to carry the princess to the finest apartment in the palace, and there lay her on a bed embroidered with gold and silver. At the sight of her, oh, she was so lovely, you might well have supposed that some bright being of the skies had floated down to earth and there dropped asleep after her long journey, for her swoon had not taken away the warmth of her complexion. Her cheeks were like carnations, her lips like coral, and though her eyes were closed and the long lashes would lift no more, her soft breathing told that she was not dead. The king commanded them all to leave her and let her sleep in peace until the hour of her awakening should arrive. Now, when the accident befell our princess, the good fairy, Hopalotopotamus, who had saved her life, happened to be in the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues away. But the news of it was brought to her in an incredibly short space of time by a little dwarf who owned a pair of 7-league boots, for these were magical boots in which you could walk 7 leagues at a single stride. Well, Hopalotopotamus set off at once to help her beloved goddaughter. And behold, in an hour, this good fairy arrived at the palace in a fiery chariot, drawn by magnificent dragons. Our king met her and handed her down from the chariot. Hopalotopotamus approved of all that he had done, but greatly foreseeing as she was, she thought that as all mortals perish within 100 years or so, when the time came for the princess to awake, she would be distressed at finding herself orphaned and alone in this old castle and the world. So, this is what she did. She touched, with her wand, everything and everyone in the palace, putting them to sleep. The king and queen, being saved for last and having kissed their daughter, they went to a place of comfort, and Hopalotopotamus, knowing that her time would draw to an end before the princess awoke, bade farewell to the king and queen, and then placed them into a long slumber, like the others. She touched, likewise, all the horses in the stables, the stable hands, the huge mastiffs in the yard, and even Lucky, the princess's 3-legged, one-eyed pet dog, and Domino, her black and white cat, that lay coiled on a cushion by her bedside. Well, the instant Hopalotopotamus touched them, they all fell asleep, not to wake until the same moment as their mistress, that all might be together again. The very spits and fires went to sleep, loaded as they were with partridges and pheasants. All this was done in a moment. The fairies were never long about their business in those days. But it so happened that Columbo, one of the king's counselors, had overslept himself that morning and came late to the palace without any knowledge of what had befallen. Well, he felt no great fear that his unpunctuality would be remarked upon, the king, as he supposed, being absent in the country. Nevertheless, he took the precaution of letting himself in by a small concealed door, and having done so, missed being observed by the fairy and touched by her wand. Entering his office and perceiving that his undersecretary, usually so brisk, and all his clerks rested their heads on their desks in attitudes of sleep, Columbo drew the conclusion that something had happened, for he was an excellent judge of natural slumber and odd findings. The farther he penetrated into the palace, the stronger his suspicion became. He withdrew on tiptoe. Though by nature and habit a lazy man, he was capable of sudden decision. And returning to his home, he caused notices to be posted up, forbidding anyone to approach the castle, the inmates of which were suffering from an unknown affliction or sleeping sickness. Well, these notices were unnecessary, however, for within a few hours, there grew up all around the park such a number of trees of all sizes and such a tangle of briars and undergrowth that neither beast nor man could find a passage through. Well, they grew until nothing but the tops of the castle towers could be seen, and these from only a good way off. Well, there was no mistake about it. The fairy had done her work well, and now the princess might sleep with no fear of visits from the inquisitive. "100 years had now passed since the castle and its occupants were enchanted. In time, the kingdom slowly forgot the real story and what had happened there, and it was transformed into legend, folklore, or simply an unreachable treasure. One day, the incomparable young Prince Fluoride happened to brush by the dense, tangled forest while hunting on that side of the country, and asked, "What were those towers pushing up above the forest?" Well, those in his company answered him as to the tales that they had heard through the years. Some said it was an old castle, haunted by ghosts. Others, that all the wizards and witches of the country met there to keep their dark Sabbath. The most general opinion was that an ogre dwelt there, and that he carried off to it all the children he could catch to eat them at his ease. But no one could follow him, for he alone knew how to find a passage through the briars and brambles. Well, the prince, he could not tell which to believe of all these informants, for all gave their versions with equal confidence, as commonly happened with those who talk on matters of which they can know nothing for certain. He was turning from one to another in perplexity when a peasant spoke up and said, "Oh, your highness, long ago I heard my father tell that there was in yonder castle a princess, the most beautiful that man has ever seen, that she must lie there, asleep, for 100 years, and that one day she will be awakened by a king's son for whom she was destined. And though many had tried to reach the princess, they all became entangled in the foliage and briars, and died most horribly." Well, at these words, Prince Fluoride became afire with passion and an unexplained compulsion. He believed without dwelling upon it that he could accomplish this fine adventure, and, driven on by love and ambition, he resolved to explore then and there and discover the truth for himself. Spurring on his horse, he charged through the wood, and had disappeared into it before his attendants guessed his design. Well, they called to him to come back, but he was gone. Fluoride suddenly found himself facing the dense wall of foliage and the remains of those who had failed their quests, and was about to fling himself bodily into the undergrowth, when as by magic, all the great trees, shrubs, creepers, ivies, briars, and brambles unlaced themselves of their own accord and drew aside to let him pass. Well, he found himself within a long glade or avenue, at the end of which glimmered the walls of an old castle, and towards this he mounted his horse again and rode. It surprised him somewhat that none of his attendants were following him, the reason being that as soon as he had passed through it, the undergrowth closed tight behind him. Well, he heard their voices, fainter and fainter behind him, beyond the barrier, calling, beseeching him to answer, to come back. But he held on his way without one backward look. For he was a prince, young and stupid, but valiant. Well, he came to the castle, and pushing aside the ivies that hung like a curtain over the gateway, entered a wide outer court, and stood still for a moment, holding his breath while his eyes traveled over a scene that might well have frozen them with terror. For the court was silent, dreadfully silent, save the small eerie whispers of wind. Yet it was by no means empty. On all sides and in all corners lay straight, stiff bodies of men, women, and beasts, as if death had reaped its harvest. Nevertheless, as he continued to gaze, his courage returned, for the pimpled noses and ruddy faces of the guards told him that they were no worse off than being asleep, and their cups, which yet still held a few drops of wine, proved that they had fallen asleep over a drinking bout, or so he thought. He stepped by them, and passed across to a second-grade court paved with marble, mounted a broad flight of marble steps leading to the main doorway, and entered a guard-room. Just within the doorway, where the guards stood in rank with shouldered halberds, Fluoride noticed that every man of them was fast asleep and snoring his best. He made his way through a number of rooms filled with ladies and gentlemen, some standing, others sitting, but all asleep. He drew aside a heavy purple curtain and once more held his breath, for he was looking into the great hall of state where at a long table sat and slumbered the king with his council. The Lord Chancellor slept in the act of dipping his pen into an inkpot. The Archbishop in the act of taking snuff. And between the spectacles on the Archbishop's nose and the spectacles of the Lord Chancellor's, a spider had spun a beautiful web. Prince Fluoride tiptoed very carefully past these noble sleepers, and leaving the hall by another door, came to the foot of the grand staircase. Up this too he went, wandered along a corridor to his right, and stopping by chance at one of the many doors, opened it, and looked into a bathroom lined with mirrors, and having in its midst, sunk in the floor, a huge round basin of whitest porcelain, wherein a spring of water bubbled deliciously. 3 steps led down to the bath, and at the end of them stood a couch with towels and a court suit laid ready, exquisitely embroidered and complete with the daintiest of lace ruffles and the most delicate of linen. The prince thought that he had hunted and trekked hard, for the mirrors showed him that he was travel-stained. So, having by this time learnt to accept any new wonder without question, he undressed himself and took a bath, which he thoroughly enjoyed. Nor was he altogether astonished when he tried on the clothes to find that they fitted him perfectly. Even the rosetted shoes of satin might have been made to his measure. Having arrayed himself thus, he resumed his quest along the corridor. The very next door he tried opened on a chamber all paneled with white and gold, and there, on a bed with the curtains which were drawn, he beheld the loveliest vision he had ever seen. A princess, of a beauty so brilliant that he could not believe her of this world, but more an angel in repose. But she lay still, so still. Prince Fluoride drew near, trembling and wondering, and sank on his knees beside her. Still, she lay scarcely seeming to breathe, and he bent and touched with his lips the little hand that rested light as a rose leaf on the coverlet. With that, as the long spell of her enchantment came to an end, the princess awaked and looked at him with eyes more tender than a first sight of him might seem to excuse. "Is that you, my prince?" she asked. "You have been a long while for my waiting." The prince, charmed by these words, and still more by the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to find the words for the joy in his heart. Oh, he assured her that he loved her better than his own self. Their speech after this was not very coherent, for they gazed at each other for long stretches more than they talked. But if eloquence lacked, there was plenty of love at first sight for explanation. He, to be sure, showed the most embarrassment, and no need to wonder at this. Aurora had 100 years to think over what she would say to him, for I hold it not unlikely, though the story does not say anything of this, that her godmother, Hopalotopotamus, had taken care to amuse her by giving, during her long sleep, some pleasurable dreams and visions of her prince. In short, the Princess Aurora and Prince Fluoride conversed for 4 hours without saying a word. Meanwhile, all the palace and grounds had awakened with the princess. In the council chamber, the king opened his eyes. The Lord Chancellor, dipping his quill into the dry ink pot, asked the Archbishop in a whisper how many T's there were in regrettable. The Archbishop, taking a pinch of snuff that had long ago turned to dust, answered with a terrific sneeze, which again was drowned by the striking of all the clocks in the palace as they started to frantically make up for lost time. Dogs barked, doors banged. The princess's parrot screamed in his cage and was answered by the peacocks squawking from the terrace. Amid the hubbub, the Minister for Agriculture, forgetting his manners, made a trumpet of his hands and bawled across the table, begging His Majesty to adjourn for dinner. In short, everyone's first thought was of his own need, and as they were not in love, they were ready to die with hunger. Even the Queen, generally sweet and kind, lost her patience at length, and sent one of her attendants with word that she, for her part, was keen set for something to eat, and word for the princess that in the Queen's young days it had been customary for young ladies released from enchantments to accept congratulations of their parents without a second's delay, and that it was supper time. Prince Fluoride helped the princess to rise. She was completely dressed, and magnificently as well. Taking his beloved Princess Aurora by the hand, Fluoride led her to her parents, who embraced her passionately, and their first reunion now over, turned to and welcomed Fluoride as a son, being charmed, quite apart from their gratitude, by the modest gallantry of his address. They passed into the great dining room lined with mirrors, where they supped and were served by the royal attendants. Violins and oboes played music that was, well, out of fashion, but still excellent, and the meal was scarcely concluded before the company enjoyed a very pleasant surprise. Prince Fluoride, having no eyes but for his love, might be excused if he forgot that his attendants must, long before now, have carried home their report. But it was agreed, then and there, and after supper without a loss of time, the Archbishop married Prince Fluoride and Princess Aurora in the chapel of the castle. The king and queen saw them to their chamber, and the first maid of honor drew the curtain. They slept a little. Well, the princess had no occasion, for she had just slept 100 years, and Prince Fluoride, well, he was in love. Two years passed, and rising one early morning, Prince Fluoride left Aurora and their now 2 children, a daughter named after her, and a son named Day, for he was just as bright and cheerful as a summer morn, to return home, where his father and mother must have been anxious about his account. Upon arriving, the prince told the king and queen that he lost his way in the forest as he was hunting, and having been injured, he had lain at a cottage of a collier who gave him cheese and brown bread to regain his strength and heal. The king, his father, who was of an easy disposition, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded the story was true, and seeing that he went hunting almost every day, and that he always had some excuse ready when he had lain out for even 3 or 4 nights in a row, she no longer doubted that he had some little lover or a wife, perhaps, somewhere, for he had been gone 2 years. The queen said, more than once to her son, in order to bring him to speak to her freely, that a young man must have and take his pleasures, but not lose sight of his family or duty. However, Fluoride never dared to trust her with his secret. Oh, he feared his mother, the queen, for though he loved her, she was of the race of the ogres, and the king would never have married her had it not been for her vast riches and her ability to assume human form. Well, it was even whispered about in the court that she had ogreish inclinations, and that whenever she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to refrain from falling upon them and eating them. So, the prince would never tell her one word about Aurora and their children. About 2 years after returning home, Fluoride's father, the king, was dead, and now he saw himself become king and master. So, he openly declared his marriage, and he went into great ceremony to fetch his queen and children from her father's castle. Oh, they made a magnificent entry into the capital city, she riding between her 2 children. Shortly after his return, King Fluoride went to make war with the Emperor Vizzini, his neighbor. Vizzini had encroached upon the kingdom for far too long, and made it known that he intended to kidnap the queen and force Fluoride to bend the knee to his dominion. And since this was not Asia, Vizzini thought it inconceivable that his genius plan for domination would fail. So, Fluoride took his army and marched across the road. I said Vizzini was his neighbor. Anyway, he left control of the kingdom and his wife and children to the queen mother. Some say that Fluoride's mother had cast a spell upon him, for his wife should have been Queen Regent and ruled in his stead. Fluoride was likely to be at war all summer, and as he had departed, the Queen Mother sent her daughter-in-law and her children to a country house secluded in the woods, that she might, with more ease, gratify her horrible longing. Some few days after sending Aurora and her children to the remote estate, she went there herself and said to her head chef of the kitchen,
I have in mind to eat little Aurora for my dinner tomorrow."
"Oh, madam," cried the chef.
"I will have it so,"
replied the queen, and this she spoke in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat.
"And will eat her with, an onion sauce."
No, the poor chef. He knew very well that he must not play tricks with an ogress, for his and his wife's lives were in jeopardy, being witnesses and all. He took his great knife and went up into little Aurora's chamber. She was then but 4 years old, and came up to him jumping and laughing to hug him around the neck and ask him for some candy. Upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hand, and he went into the backyard, killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such a good sauce that his mistress assured him that she had never eaten anything so good in her life. He had at the same time taken up little Aurora and carried her to his wife to conceal her in his lodgings at the end of the courtyard. About 8 days afterwards, the wicked queen said to the chef,
I will eat upon the little boy Day this night."
He answered, not a word, being resolved to cheat her, as he had done before. He went out to find little Day, and saw him with a little sword in his hand, in which he was fencing with a great monkey, the child being then only 3 years of age. He took him up in his arms, and carried him to his wife, that she might conceal him in her chamber along with his sister. And in the place of little Day, the chef cooked up a young lamb, very tender, which the ogress found to be,
so wonderfully good.
This was going well, almighty well at this point, until one evening the wicked queen said to her chef,
"I will eat the queen with the same sauce I had with her children."
It was now that the poor chef despaired of being able to deceive her any longer. The young queen had the appearance of 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had spent asleep. Her skin was somewhat tough, though very fair and white, and how to find in the yard a beast so firm was what puzzled him. He took then a resolution that he might save his own life, to cut the queen's throat. And going up into her chamber, with intent to do it at once, he put himself into a great fury, as possible as he could, and came into the young queen's room with his dagger in his hand. He would not, however, surprise her, but told her, with a great deal of respect, the orders he had received from the Queen Mother. "Do it. Just do it," she said, stretching out her neck. "Execute your orders, and then I shall go and see my children, my poor children, whom I so much and so tenderly love." For she thought them dead, ever since they had been taken away without her knowledge. "Oh, no, no, madam," whispered the chef, all in tears. "You shall not die, and yet you shall see your children again. but it must be in my lodgings, where I have concealed them, and I shall deceive the queen once more by giving her, in your stead, a young deer." Upon this, he forthwith conducted her to his chamber, where, leaving her to embrace her children and crying along with them, he went and dressed a hind, which the queen had for her supper, and devoured it with the same appetite as if it had been the young queen. Oh, exceedingly was she delighted with her cruelty, and she had invented a story to tell the king upon his return, how ravenous wolves had eaten up his wife and their 2 children. One evening, as she was, according to her custom, rambling around about the courts and yards of the palace to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard in a cellar room little Day crying for his mother, who was going to punish him because he had been naughty. And she also heard at the same time little Aurora begging pardon for her brother. Oh, the ogress presently knew the voice of the queen and her children, and being quite mad that she had been thus deceived, she commanded the next morning, by break of day, with a most horrible voice which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the court a large tub, into which she cast a spell, filling it with venomous snakes and other deadly creatures, in order to have thrown into it the queen, her children, the chef and his wife, and maid. All for whom she had called were to be brought henceforth, with their hands tied behind them. So, those named were brought out accordingly, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub when the king, who was not so soon expected as the war had ended quickly, entered the court, and on horseback in his haste to return, and asked, with the utmost astonishment, "What the is going on around here?"
What be this whore mine eyes doth see?
No one dared tell him, when suddenly the ogress queen, all enraged to see what had happened and at the ruination of her plans, threw herself head first into the tub, and was instantly slain by the ugly creatures she had ordered for others. Well, the king could not be but very sorry, for she was his mother. But he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and children, and safe in the knowledge that Vizzini was no longer a threat to his kingdom after dying from some bad wine or something. And so, the kingdom was at peace, the palace refreshed anew, and therein they lived happy all the rest of their days. To hear more stories, click on one of those playlists and subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.